What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you the most threw you away like yesterday's garbage? Marcus Delaney was 18 years old, sleeping behind a gas station dumpster in Gallatin, Tennessee, with 8 crumpled dollar bills in his pocket and a bruise the shape of a man's fist still darkening beneath his left eye. But what he would find sealed inside a rusted Footlocker, untouched since 1971, would shatter every lie he had ever been told about who he was and where he came from. The night Marcus became homeless wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it look. There was no screaming match that built to an explosive climax. There was no slow unraveling that gave him time to prepare. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of gray, unremarkable Wednesday that most people forget by Thursday morning. Marcus came home from his shift at the Minute Mart on Route 31, a part-time job he had held since he was 16, working the register for $7.50 an hour to help cover the electricity bill his stepfather, Dale Roush, always claimed he couldn't afford. The front door of the double-wide trailer on Plunkett Creek Road was locked. That was unusual. Dale never locked the front door because the deadbolt had been broken since Marcus was 14, and Dale was categorically opposed to spending money on anything that didn't come in a bottle. Marcus knocked. He knocked again. He could hear the television blaring inside, the muffled roar of a stock car race, Dale's preferred background noise for drinking. The door swung open, but it wasn't Dale standing there. It was Ray Roush, Dale's older brother, a man Marcus had only met a handful of times at Thanksgiving dinners where nobody gave thanks for anything. Ray was a thick-set man with a shaved head, a goatee stained yellow from cigarettes, and the kind of cold, appraising eyes that made you feel like he was calculating your scrap value. "You Marcus?" Ray asked, though he clearly already knew. "Yeah. Where's Dale?" "Dale's gone. Moved down to his girlfriend's place in Murfreesboro. Left me the trailer." Ray leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance with his body. "And he didn't leave no room for you in the arrangement." Marcus blinked. "What do you mean, gone? My stuff is in there." "My clothes, your stuff is out back," Ray interrupted, jerking his thumb toward the side of the trailer. "In the yard. Dale said you ain't his responsibility no more. You turned 18 last month. You're grown. Time to act like it." Marcus stood there, the words refusing to arrange themselves into anything that made sense. He had lived in that trailer since he was 6 years old, since his mother, Angela Delaney, had married Dale after Marcus's biological father disappeared. Angela had died of an aggressive form of lung cancer when Marcus was 11. Dale had kept Marcus around after that, not out of love or obligation, but because the state sent a monthly survivor's benefit check for Angela's minor child. A check that stopped the day Marcus turned 18. Marcus walked around to the backyard. His belongings were scattered across the muddy grass like the aftermath of a yard sale nobody attended. His clothes were dumped in a loose pile, already soaking in the evening drizzle. His school textbooks, the ones he had kept even though he had dropped out at 17 to work more hours when Dale demanded more money for the household, were fanned open in the dirt, their pages swelling with rainwater. The small wooden box where he kept his mother's only photograph, her social security card, and a thin gold bracelet she used to wear on Sundays, was sitting on top of the pile, its lid hanging open. Marcus grabbed the box first. He checked inside. The photograph was there. The social security card was there. The bracelet was gone. He walked back to the front door. Ray was still standing there, now holding an open can of beer. "There was a gold bracelet in my mother's box," Marcus said, his voice remarkably steady for a boy whose entire world had just been dismantled. "It was hers. It's the only thing I have left of her." Ray took a long sip of beer, maintaining eye contact. "Don't know nothing about no bracelet. Dale didn't mention it. Maybe you lost it." Marcus knew. He knew with the absolute, crystalline certainty of someone who has been lied to by experts his entire life. Dale had taken it. Dale, who had cashed every one of Angela's benefit checks for 7 years, who had never once bought Marcus a winter coat or a pair of shoes that weren't from the Goodwill clearance bin, who had made Marcus pay rent on his own dead mother's trailer starting at 16, had taken the one piece of her that money couldn't replace. "I want to talk to Dale," Marcus said. "Dale don't want to talk to you," Ray replied, and closed the door. Marcus stood in the rain for a long time. He thought about kicking the door down. He thought about calling the police, but the police in Gallatin knew Dale Roush, and they knew Marcus as Dale's quiet, unremarkable stepson and Marcus understood instinctively that a black teenager accusing a white man of theft in rural Sumner County would not end with justice. He thought about begging. He dismissed that thought the fastest. His mother had taught him one thing before the cancer ate her alive, and it was this: you do not beg people who have already decided you are worthless. You leave, and you make them wrong. Marcus gathered what he could carry. He stuffed his least wet clothes into a plastic grocery bag. He zipped his mother's wooden box inside his work jacket. He put his cracked-screen phone in his back pocket and started walking. He had no car. Dale had sold the used Corolla that Angela had originally bought for Marcus's eventual 16th birthday, pocketing the $1,400 without apology. Marcus walked 4 miles in the rain to the Minute Mart, where he sat on the bench outside the entrance, staring at the parking lot, trying to calculate how long a person could survive on the $68 in his checking account and the $8 in cash in his pocket. The answer, as it turned out, was about 2 weeks. Marcus slept behind the Minute Mart for the first 3 nights, curled up between the dumpster and the propane cage, where the heat from the compressor kept the air just warm enough to survive. His manager, a woman named Patrice who had always been kind to him, let him use the employee bathroom to wash up before his shifts, but she made it clear she couldn't let him sleep inside the store. Corporate policy. Liability issues. Patrice gave him a sleeping bag from her garage and a $20 bill from her own wallet. It was the single greatest act of kindness anyone had shown Marcus in 7 years, and he folded that 20 so carefully it might as well have been a sacred document. By the end of the first week, Marcus had been fired. Not by Patrice, but by the district manager who arrived for an unannounced inspection and discovered that an employee was essentially living on the premises. Marcus was terminated for violating the company's code of conduct regarding loitering on corporate property after hours. Patrice cried when she told him. Marcus didn't. He had run out of tears somewhere around the 4th night behind the dumpster, when a group of older kids had thrown a bottle at him from a passing truck and called him a name that he would never repeat but would never forget. Without the job, the math collapsed entirely. Marcus had $76 to his name. He walked to the public library during the day, using the free computers to search for jobs, shelters, anything. The nearest homeless shelter was in Nashville, 30 miles away, and it had a 6-week waiting list. He applied for emergency housing assistance through the county, but the intake coordinator told him, with genuine sympathy and absolute helplessness, that single males aged 18 to 24 were the lowest priority category in the system. He would need to wait. Marcus waited. He waited on park benches. He waited under overpasses. He waited in the back pews of churches that opened their doors during the day but locked them at night. Tennessee in November is not as brutal as Minnesota or Michigan, but the nights still dropped into the low 30s, and Marcus learned quickly that cold doesn't need to kill you to break you. It just needs to be constant. It seeps into your joints, your thoughts, your will. By the end of the 2nd week, Marcus had stopped applying for jobs. He had stopped going to the library. He spent most of his time sitting on a concrete bench behind the Sumner County Courthouse, watching people walk past him without seeing him, and wondering if his mother would be ashamed of what he had become or heartbroken by what had been done to him. It was on that bench, on a particularly bitter Friday afternoon, that Marcus saw the flyer. It was stapled to a telephone pole, half torn, flapping in the wind. He almost didn't read it. He almost let it tear away and disappear into the gutter with the rest of the world's discarded paper. But one word caught his eye. Auction. The flyer read, Sumner County Public Auction. Abandoned and seized storage units. Saturday, November 19th, 10 a.m. Riverside Self-Storage, 4120 Highway 31E. All sales final. Cash only. Starting bids as low as $5. Marcus read it again. Then a third time. $5. He had $8 in his pocket and $62 in his checking account that he couldn't access because his debit card had been declined twice this week, and he suspected Dale had somehow reported the account as fraudulent. $8. He could buy a storage unit for as little as $5. It wouldn't give him a home. It wouldn't give him a job, but it might give him something to sell. A piece of furniture. An old television. Anything that could be converted into another week of survival. He tore the flyer from the pole and put it in his pocket. Saturday morning broke cold and clear, the sky a hard ceramic blue that made the bare trees look like cracks in porcelain. Marcus walked the 2 miles to Riverside Self-Storage, arriving 20 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. The facility was a sprawling, run-down complex of corrugated metal buildings arranged in long rows, the kind of place where people stored the things they couldn't bear to throw away but couldn't afford to keep close. The parking lot was already half full. Marcus counted about 30 people milling around, most of them older, most of them carrying the unmistakable air of regulars. There were the dealers, men and women with sharp eyes and practiced indifference who made their living buying abandoned units and flipping the contents. There were the hobbyists, retirees looking for a weekend thrill. And then there was Marcus, 18 years old, wearing every piece of clothing he owned, carrying a plastic grocery bag containing his mother's wooden box, and holding $8 so tightly in his fist that the coins were leaving impressions in his palm. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Garland Price, who wore a camouflage baseball cap and spoke with the rapid-fire cadence of a man who had been doing this for decades. Garland moved the crowd through the first row of units efficiently. Unit after unit was rolled open, inspected from the threshold, and bid upon. The first unit, packed with what appeared to be high-end exercise equipment and labeled plastic tubs, went for $420. The second, containing a leather couch and stacks of framed artwork, sold for $310. Marcus watched the numbers climb and felt the $8 in his pocket shrink to nothing. These weren't his league. These weren't even his sport. By the time the crowd reached the back row of the facility, the oldest section where the overhead lights flickered and the concrete floor was cracked and stained with decades of oil and rust, the group had thinned considerably. The serious buyers had already loaded their trucks. The hobbyists had gotten bored. Only about a dozen people remained, and most of them were checking their phones. Last 3 units of the day, folks, Garland announced, his voice losing some of its showman energy. These are the long-term abandonments. Some of these haven't been opened in years. No guarantees, no returns, no complaints. Let's keep it moving. Unit 19 was rolled open. Inside was a chaotic mess of cardboard boxes, a broken recliner, and what looked like bags of old clothing. A woman in a quilted vest bid $15. No one challenged her. Sold. Unit 22 contained a washing machine, a stack of bald tires, and a filing cabinet. A man in overalls took it for $25. Then Garland walked to the last unit in the row. Unit 7. The rolling door was a different color than the others, a faded military green instead of the standard orange. The padlock on it was enormous, a heavy-duty brass mechanism caked in a thick crust of greenish oxidation. The facility manager stepped forward with industrial bolt cutters and positioned the jaws around the shackle. The lock resisted. He adjusted his grip, planted his feet, and squeezed with both hands. The shackle snapped with a sharp, percussive crack that echoed off the metal walls. Garland grabbed the handle and heaved the door upward. The metal shrieked, grinding against tracks that hadn't moved in what sounded like decades. The door stuttered, stuck, then finally rolled up with a shuddering groan. The smell that poured out was unlike anything Marcus had encountered in the previous units. It wasn't the wet, mildewy rot of water-damaged junk. It was dry, ancient. It smelled like old leather, machine oil, and the particular dusty sweetness of paper that has been sealed away from sunlight for a very long time. Like opening a book that hadn't been touched in half a century. The unit was small, maybe 8 by 8, and it was nearly empty. That was what made the remaining crowd lose interest immediately. There was no furniture, no electronics, no visible treasure. The concrete floor was bare except for a thin layer of undisturbed dust. Against the back wall sat a single object. It was a military footlocker, olive drab green, scarred and dented, with heavy steel reinforcing straps and a combination padlock hanging from the front hasp. Even from the threshold, Marcus could see stenciled markings on the lid, white block letters faded but legible. "Well, that's underwhelming," muttered a man in a Carhartt jacket standing near the front. "One box. Could be empty. Could be full of old army socks," someone else added, and a few people laughed. "All right, folks," Garland said, clearly ready to wrap up and get to his truck. "One footlocker. No telling what's inside. This unit hasn't been accessed since the original contract was signed. Let's start the bidding. Who'll give me $20? Silence. The wind blew through the corridor between the storage buildings, carrying the sound of distant highway traffic. 15? Come on, folks. $15 for a genuine military footlocker. The hardware alone is worth that in scrap. Nothing. The remaining crowd was already drifting toward the parking lot. $10. Somebody give me 10. More silence. Garland sighed, pulling his cap off and running a hand over his thinning hair. $5. Last unit of the day. $5 and it's yours. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. $5 would leave him $3 between himself and absolute zero. But $3 wasn't going to save him anyway. Nothing in his pocket was going to save him. He was already drowning. The only question was whether he would drown clutching $8 or clutching whatever was inside that footlocker. $8, Marcus said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, almost swallowed by the wind. But Garland heard it. The auctioneer looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Marcus saw the man's eyes travel over his layered, mismatched clothing, his hollow cheeks, the plastic bag at his feet. Something shifted in Garland's expression. Not pity exactly. Recognition. The look of a man who understood what $8 meant when it was everything. $8 from the young man, Garland said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Going once. Going twice. He paused, scanning the empty corridor. Sold. $8. Marcus walked up to Garland on legs that felt disconnected from his body. He pulled the bills from his pocket, 5 ones, and then dug into his jeans for the rest. 3 more ones, crumpled and damp. He smoothed them out and handed them over. Garland counted them, wrote a receipt on his clipboard, and tore it off. Unit 7 is yours, son. You've got until 6 p.m. tomorrow to clear it out. Anything left behind gets hauled to the dump on your tab. Garland hesitated, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a granola bar. He held it out. Take it. You look like you could use it. Marcus took the granola bar. He didn't say thank you because he was afraid that if he opened his mouth, something other than words would come out. He just nodded, took the receipt, and walked toward Unit 7, where a single footlocker sat in the dust, waiting for him like it had been waiting for 53 years. Marcus stood alone in the corridor of Riverside Self-Storage, the auction crowd long gone, the parking lot emptying behind him. The afternoon light was already turning amber, slanting low through the gaps between the metal buildings, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. He stepped inside Unit 7 for the first time, crossing the threshold into that dry, ancient stillness. His footprints were the first to mark the dust in decades. The footlocker sat against the back wall like a patient animal. Up close, it was larger than he had estimated from the threshold. Standard military issue, olive drab, but heavier and more reinforced than anything he had seen in surplus stores. The steel straps riveted across the top and sides were thick, industrial grade, the kind designed to survive transport across oceans and war zones. The white stenciled letters on the lid were faded but still readable. PFC J. Delacroix, U.S. Army, 1971. Below the name, a serial number. Below that, stamped in smaller block letters, a single word that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. Classified. He knelt in front of the locker. The combination padlock on the front hasp was military issue as well, heavy brass with a black dial face. Marcus gripped it and pulled. It didn't budge. The mechanism was frozen solid, seized by 53 years of stillness. He tried spinning the dial. It resisted at first, then gave a grudging, gritty click as the internal pins shifted. But without the combination, spinning it was useless. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring at the lock. He had no tools. He had no bolt cutters. He had nothing but his hands and the desperate, irrational certainty that whatever was inside this footlocker mattered. He looked around the empty unit. The walls were bare corrugated steel. The floor was bare concrete. There was nothing else in the space, not a single scrap of debris, no forgotten boxes or abandoned tools. Just the locker and the dust and the fading light. Then he noticed something he had missed. In the far left corner of the unit, scratched into the concrete floor with something sharp, were numbers. They were small, no more than an inch tall, carved into the surface with enough force to leave permanent grooves. 17-42-08. Marcus stared at the numbers for a long time. Then he crawled back to the footlocker, gripped the combination dial, and began to turn. Right to 17. Left past 0 to 42. Right to 8. He pulled the shackle. The lock opened with a soft, clean click that sounded impossibly loud in the silent unit. His hands were trembling as he removed the padlock and set it on the concrete beside him. He gripped the lid of the footlocker with both hands. The hinges were stiff, fighting him, but the seal was intact. No rust had penetrated the seams. Whatever was inside had been preserved in near-perfect conditions for over half a century. He lifted the lid. The interior was lined with a thick, waxed canvas that had kept the contents bone dry. Resting on top was a folded American flag, the kind presented at military funerals, its fabric still crisp, its colors still vivid despite the years. Marcus lifted the flag carefully, instinctively, the way you handle something that belongs to the dead. Beneath the flag were layers. The first layer was a uniform, a complete United States Army dress uniform, olive green, meticulously folded, with a private first-class insignia on the shoulder and a name tape that read Delacroix. Pinned to the breast of the jacket were 3 medals. Marcus didn't know military decorations, but he recognized the Purple Heart. The ribbon was faded, but the medal itself, the gold-bordered purple enamel heart with George Washington's profile, was unmistakable. Beneath the uniform was a thick manila envelope, sealed with brittle, yellowed tape. Marcus set it aside, his curiosity burning but his hands too unsteady to open anything delicate. Below the envelope sat a leather shaving kit, the kind soldiers carried in the field. He unzipped it. Inside were not razors or soap. Instead, the kit was packed with rolls of cash. Old bills, 20s and 50s, tightly wound and secured with rubber bands that had long since dried and cracked, leaving the rolls to slowly unspool. Marcus pulled one out and unrolled it with shaking fingers. The bills were old-style currency, series 1963 and 1969, featuring designs he had never seen in circulation. He counted the first roll, $600. He counted the second, $800. There were 14 rolls total. He stopped counting after the 7th roll because his vision was blurring and his chest was so tight, he thought he might be having a heart attack. There was over $9,000 in cash stuffed into a dead soldier's shaving kit. But it was the bottom layer of the footlocker that would change Marcus Delaney's life forever. Beneath the cash, beneath a second layer of waxed canvas, sat a wooden cigar box with a Cuban label, and next to it, a small leather-bound journal with a brass clasp. Marcus opened the cigar box first. Inside, cushioned by cotton batting, were 6 gold coins. They were large, heavy, and old. Each one featured Lady Liberty on the front and an eagle on the back. The edges were reeded and the surfaces were clean, showing almost no wear. Marcus had never held a gold coin in his life, but he knew instinctively that these were not replicas. The weight alone told him that. Each coin felt like it contained its own small gravity. He turned one over in his palm, tilting it toward the fading light. Stamped beneath the eagle were the words $20 and a date. 1927. He checked the others. 1924, 1925. 1926, 1928, 1927 again. 6 $20 gold coins from the 1920s, preserved in perfect condition inside a dead soldier's footlocker for 53 years. Marcus set the cigar box down with exaggerated care, as though it might shatter if he breathed too hard. Then he picked up the leather journal. The brass clasp opened easily. The pages inside were filled with small, precise handwriting in blue ink, the penmanship of someone who had been taught cursive by nuns, or by the military, or by both. The first entry was dated March 3, 1971. The handwriting belonged to Private First Class Joseph Delacroix. Marcus began to read, and the world outside the storage unit ceased to exist. March 3, 1971. I am writing this from Walter Reed. They took my right leg below the knee 4 days ago. The morphine makes it hard to think straight, but I need to write this down before I forget, or before they make me forget. I was assigned to Firebase Ripcord in the Ashau Valley. During our extraction, I recovered documents from a collapsed NVA tunnel complex. Among the documents was a diplomatic pouch that had been taken from a downed American helicopter 6 months prior. The pouch contained original copies of intelligence assessments that directly contradicted the Pentagon's public statements about troop withdrawal timelines. Colonel Arden ordered me to hand over the pouch and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I refused. I made copies. They sent me back to the line the next day, and 3 days later, a friendly fire incident took my leg. I do not believe it was an accident. Marcus turned the pages slowly, his breath shallow. The journal entries spanned from March 1971 to December 1971, 9 months of meticulous documentation. Joseph Delacroix had been a 20-year-old soldier from New Orleans who had stumbled into something far larger than himself. The intelligence documents he had copied revealed that senior military officials had been systematically misrepresenting casualty figures and operational assessments to Congress. Delacroix had tried to report through proper channels. He had written to his commanding officer. He had written to the inspector general. He had written to a congressman from Louisiana. Every letter was either ignored or intercepted. The later entries grew darker, more paranoid, but also more precise. Delacroix detailed how he was discharged from Walter Reed with a Purple Heart and a medical discharge, how he returned to the United States, how he was followed, how his apartment in New Orleans was broken into twice, how his copies of the documents were stolen from his desk. But Delacroix was smarter than they expected. He had made a second set of copies, photographed on microfilm, and hidden them inside the lining of his dress uniform jacket. The same jacket now sitting in the footlocker at Marcus's knees. The final entry was dated December 22, 1971. I am leaving New Orleans tonight. A man named William Hargrove, who says he works for a congressional oversight committee, has contacted me. He says he can protect me if I testify. But I don't trust him. I don't trust anyone anymore. I am taking everything, the uniform, the microfilm, the coins my grandmother gave me, and I am sealing it in the footlocker Sergeant Mills gave me at Walter Reed. I am driving north. I have rented a storage unit in a small town in Tennessee where no one knows my name. If I don't come back for this, then they got to me. Whoever finds this, please know that I tried to do the right thing. I tried to tell the truth. The coins are for whoever opens this box. Consider them payment for finishing what I started. Marcus closed the journal. His hands were no longer shaking. Something had shifted inside him, a cold, heavy clarity settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He was 18 years old, homeless, penniless, sitting on the concrete floor of a rented storage unit, holding the last testimony of a man who had been silenced 53 years ago, a man who had been wounded, discarded, and erased. Marcus understood that feeling more intimately than Joseph Delacroix could have imagined. He opened the manila envelope next. Inside were 3 items. The first was a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. It showed a young black man in army fatigues, lean and serious-eyed, standing in front of a helicopter on a dirt landing zone. The jungle behind him was a dense, impenetrable wall of green. On the back of the photograph, in the same precise handwriting from the journal, were the words "Me at Ripcord. May 1970. Tell Mama I was brave." The second item was a single sheet of military stationery, typed and stamped with an official seal. It was a formal letter of reprimand, accusing Private First Class Delacroix of insubordination and unauthorized possession of classified materials. The letter was signed by a Colonel Raymond T. Arden. The third item was a folded piece of newsprint, brittle and yellow. Marcus unfolded it with agonizing care. It was a clipping from the New Orleans Times-Picayune, dated January 15, 1972. The headline read, "Vietnam Veteran Missing. Foul Play Suspected." The article described how Joseph Delacroix, age 21, a recently discharged Army private and Purple Heart recipient, had disappeared from his New Orleans apartment. His car was found abandoned at a rest stop on Interstate 65 in Alabama. No body was ever recovered. The case was classified as a missing person and never solved. Marcus sat in the gathering darkness of Unit 7, surrounded by the remnants of a dead man's courage, and understood 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the gold coins in the cigar box were worth far more than their face value. He didn't know exactly how much, but he knew that uncirculated gold coins from the 1920s were the kind of thing that appeared on auction shows with estimates that made people gasp. Second, the journal and the microfilm hidden in the uniform jacket constituted evidence of a military cover-up that had likely cost Joseph Delacroix his life. This was not a piece of forgotten history. This was a wound that had never been allowed to heal. And third, Marcus Delaney was not going to sell the coins, take the cash, and walk away. He was going to finish what Joseph Delacroix started. But first, he had to survive the night. Marcus closed the footlocker, replaced the combination lock, and scrambled the dial. He pulled the rolling door of Unit 7 down as far as it would go, leaving a 6-inch gap at the bottom for air. He spread his sleeping bag on the concrete floor next to the Footlocker, ate the granola bar Garland had given him, and lay in the darkness, listening to the wind rattle the corrugated walls. His mind would not stop moving. The $9,000 in cash changed his immediate calculus entirely. It was enough to rent a room, buy food, get a phone that worked, and buy time. But the gold coins and the journal changed something deeper. They gave him a purpose. For the first time since his mother died, Marcus Delaney had a reason to get up in the morning that was bigger than his own survival. He slept fitfully, waking every hour to the sounds of the facility settling in the cold. At dawn, he rose, packed the cash, the coins, the journal, and the photograph into his plastic grocery bag, layering his mother's wooden box on top. He left the uniform and the flag in the Footlocker, locked it, and rolled the unit door down. He walked 2 miles to the nearest motel, a place called the Traveler's Rest on Highway 31E, where a tired woman behind bulletproof glass rented him a room for $42 a night. Marcus paid for 3 nights in advance with the old bills. The woman examined the vintage currency with raised eyebrows, but accepted it without comment. Legal tender was legal tender. The motel room was small, stained, and smelled like industrial disinfectant, and it was the most beautiful place Marcus had ever stood. He had a door that locked. He had a bed with sheets. He had hot water. He stood under the shower for 20 minutes, the water turning gray, and then brown, and then clear, washing away 2 weeks of homelessness. He put on the cleanest clothes from his bag, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the journal again. He read it cover to cover, twice. The second time, he took notes on the back of the motel's stationery pad, writing down every name, every date, every reference. Colonel Raymond T. Arden, William Hargrove, Firebase Ripcord, the A. Shao Valley, the Congressional Oversight Committee, the Pentagon Assessments. He wrote until his hand cramped, then switched hands and kept writing. By noon, he had a timeline. By 2 in the afternoon, he had questions. And by 3, he was sitting at the public computer terminal in the Gallatin branch of the Sumner County Public Library, searching for answers. Joseph Delacroix's disappearance in January 1972 had generated exactly 4 news articles, all from Louisiana papers. The national press had not covered it. Marcus found a brief mention in a 1973 Senate subcommittee report on Vietnam-era intelligence handling, but Delacroix's name was misspelled, and the reference led nowhere. Colonel Raymond T. Arden, however, had left a much larger footprint. After Vietnam, Arden had risen through the ranks, retiring as a brigadier general in 1989. He had then entered the private sector, serving on the boards of 3 defense contractors. He had died in 2011 at the age of 82. His obituary in the Washington Post described him as a decorated war hero and tireless advocate for veterans' affairs. There was no mention of Firebase Ripcord. There was no mention of Joseph Delacroix. William Hargrove was harder to find. The name was common, and Marcus spent an hour sifting through results before finding a connection. A William R. Hargrove had served as a staff investigator for the Senate Armed Services Committee from 1969 to 1974. After leaving government service, Hargrove had become a partner at a Washington lobbying firm called Hargrove, Steen and Associates. The firm's client list, available on a government transparency database, included 2 of the same defense contractors that Colonel Arden had served on the boards of. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The man who had contacted Delacroix, claiming to offer protection, had later gone into business with the very military establishment Delacroix was trying to expose. Hargrove hadn't been trying to help. He had been trying to locate the evidence so it could be destroyed. And when Delacroix vanished, so did the case. Marcus closed the browser, erased the search history out of a caution he didn't fully understand but instinctively obeyed, and walked back to the motel. He sat on the bed with the cigar box open on the nightstand, the 6 gold coins catching the pale light from the window. He picked up his cracked phone and searched for the current value of a 1927 St. Gaudens double eagle gold coin in uncirculated condition. The first result made his vision swim. Estimated auction value for a single coin in mint state condition ranged from $2,800 to over $4,200 depending on grade. 6 coins. At the low end, that was nearly $17,000. At the high end, over $25,000. Combined with the $9,000 in cash, Marcus was sitting on somewhere between $26,000 and $34,000. 2 days ago, he had $8. 2 days ago, he had been sleeping behind a dumpster. The money was transformative, but Marcus understood with a maturity that belied his 18 years that the journal was worth more than every coin and every bill in that Footlocker combined. The journal was a man's last words. It was proof that someone had told the truth and been destroyed for it. It was the kind of document that journalists built careers on and institutions spent fortunes trying to bury. And Marcus had it because he had spent his last $8 on a hunch and a prayer in a storage facility parking lot. He needed help. Not the kind of help you get from a shelter or a social worker. He needed someone who understood what this journal meant, someone who could verify the microfilm, authenticate the documents, and protect both the evidence and the 18-year-old kid holding it. Marcus thought about who he could trust, and the list was devastatingly short. He had no family. He had no friends with resources. He had no connections to anyone in journalism, law, academia, or government. He was a high school dropout from a trailer park in Gallatin, Tennessee, holding evidence of a 50-year-old military cover-up in a motel room that smelled like bleach. Then he remembered a name. Ms. Amara Osei. She had been his 11th grade history teacher at Gallatin High before he dropped out. She was the only teacher who had ever treated him like he had a mind worth developing. She had given him books to read, real books, not textbooks. She had told him once, during a lesson on the Pentagon Papers, that the most dangerous thing in the world was not a weapon. It was a document that proved someone in power had lied. Marcus hadn't understood what she meant at the time. He understood it now. He found her number in the school directory online and called from the motel phone. She answered on the third ring. Ms. Osei? This is Marcus Delaney. I was in your American history class 2 years ago. I need your help. I found something, and I don't know what to do with it. There was a pause on the line. Then, in the warm, deliberate voice he remembered from classroom lectures that made the past feel alive and urgent, Amara Osei said, Marcus, tell me everything. Amara Osei arrived at the Traveler's Rest Motel at 9:15 the following morning, driving a dented burgundy Subaru with a faded bumper sticker that read well-behaved women seldom make history. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped natural hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of posture that communicated authority without arrogance. She wore a wool peacoat over a turtleneck and carried a worn leather messenger bag over one shoulder. When Marcus opened the motel room door, she looked at him for a long, quiet moment, taking in the hollow cheeks, the bruise beneath his eye now fading to a sickly yellow, and the room behind him with its stained carpet and rattling window unit. She didn't offer pity. She didn't ask if he was okay. She stepped inside, set her bag on the table, and said, "Show me." Marcus laid everything out on the bed. The journal, the photograph, the letter of reprimand, the newspaper clipping, the cigar box with the 6 gold coins, the manila envelope, the cash he had already counted and organized into neat stacks on the nightstand. Amara put on a pair of reading gloves she pulled from her messenger bag, the kind archivists use when handling fragile documents, and picked up the journal first. She read slowly, turning each page with deliberate care, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to something deeper and more troubled as she moved through the entries. She read the entire journal without speaking. It took her 45 minutes. When she finished, she set it down, removed her glasses, and pressed her fingertips against her closed eyes. "Marcus," she said quietly, "do you understand what this is?" "I think so. This is a primary source document from a Vietnam-era whistleblower who was almost certainly killed for what he knew. The microfilm he mentions, if it's still intact inside that uniform jacket, could corroborate intelligence failures that historians have debated for decades. This isn't a curiosity. This is a piece of American history that was deliberately buried." She paused, replacing her glasses. "And it's also extremely dangerous to hold without institutional protection." "Dangerous how?" "The men Delacroix named, Arden and Hargrove, are dead. But institutions have longer memories than individuals. Defense contractors, lobbying firms, government agencies, they all have legal teams whose entire purpose is to ensure that certain documents never surface. If word gets out that an 18-year-old in Gallatin, Tennessee, is sitting on authenticated Vietnam-era intelligence documents, you will have lawyers and possibly worse at your door within a week." Marcus absorbed this. "So what do we do?" Amara opened her messenger bag and pulled out a legal pad. First, we authenticate. Nothing matters until we can prove this is real. I have a colleague at Vanderbilt, Dr. Leonard Croft. He runs the university's Center for Military and Veteran Studies. He's one of the foremost experts on Vietnam-era documentation in the country, and more importantly, he spent his career fighting to declassify records that the Pentagon wanted kept sealed. If anyone can verify the journal, the microfilm, and the provenance of this Footlocker, it's Leonard. Second, we protect you legally. You purchased this unit at a lawful public auction. You have the receipt. Under Tennessee law, the contents of an abandoned storage unit sold at auction become the legal property of the buyer. But we need a lawyer to formalize that before anyone challenges it. And third, she looked at him steadily. We need to talk about the coins and the cash. What about them? The cash is yours. Old currency, legal tender, no restrictions. The coins are almost certainly yours as well, but their value is significant enough that selling them through the wrong channel could attract attention you don't want. We need a reputable dealer, someone who can appraise and authenticate the coins, facilitate a private sale if you choose, and document the transaction so the IRS doesn't come knocking in 2 years. Marcus nodded. He felt, for the first time in weeks, like the ground beneath him was solidifying. Not because of the money, because someone was standing next to him and treating his situation like a problem to be solved rather than a tragedy to be observed. Amara made 3 phone calls from the motel room. The first was to Dr. Leonard Croft at Vanderbilt, who, upon hearing a summary of the journal's contents, canceled his afternoon lecture and told Amara to bring the materials to his office the following day. The second call was to a civil rights attorney in Nashville named Denise Watkins, a woman Amara described as the kind of lawyer who made powerful people lose sleep. The third call was to a numismatic dealer in Nashville named Harold Berenson, a semi-retired coin specialist who had authenticated collections for the Smithsonian. The next 72 hours moved with a velocity that made Marcus feel like he was watching his own life from the outside. Amara drove him to Nashville the following morning. Dr. Croft's office at Vanderbilt was a cluttered, book-lined room that smelled like coffee and old paper. Croft was a wiry man in his 60s with a white beard and the intense, restless energy of someone who had spent his life arguing with the official record. He examined the journal page by page under a magnifying lamp, cross-referencing dates, unit designations, and personnel names against a database he maintained of Vietnam-era military records. The examination took 4 hours. When Croft finally looked up, his expression was one Marcus would never forget. It was the face of a man who had just found something he had been looking for his entire career. "The journal is authentic," Croft said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Every operational detail checks out. Firebase ripcord, the A Shao Valley extraction timeline, the unit designations, all of it matches declassified after-action reports. But more importantly, Delacroix references specific intelligence assessments by their internal document numbers. I have been trying to locate those assessments for 15 years. The Pentagon has repeatedly denied they exist. If the microfilm contains what Delacroix claims, this is the single most significant Vietnam-era discovery since the Pentagon Papers." The microfilm was the next step. Croft brought in a colleague from the university's conservation lab, a woman named Dr. Yolanda Reeves, who spent an entire afternoon carefully disassembling the lining of the dress uniform jacket. The microfilm was there, exactly where Delacroix's journal said it would be, sealed inside a thin metal canister stitched between the jacket's outer shell and its silk lining. The canister was airtight. When Dr. Reeves opened it under controlled laboratory conditions, the film inside was pristine. It took 2 days to develop and digitize the microfilm. The images were devastating. They contained 17 pages of internal Pentagon intelligence assessments, each stamped top secret and dated between March and August of 1970. The assessments contradicted, in specific and quantifiable terms, the public statements made by senior military officials to Congress regarding troop withdrawal timelines, enemy force strength, and projected casualty rates. In one document, a senior analyst had written in the margin, in handwriting that Croft's team would later attribute to a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, "These numbers cannot be released. Adjust for congressional presentation." Denise Watkins, the attorney, moved just as quickly. She filed an emergency motion establishing Marcus as the lawful owner of Unit 7's contents, citing the auction receipt, the facility's legal clearance documentation, and Tennessee's abandoned property statutes. She also filed a preemptive protective order sealing the contents from any third-party claim while authentication was underway. When Marcus asked her how much her services would cost, Denise looked at him over the top of her reading glasses and said, "Young man, I've spent 20 years waiting for a case that actually matters. You couldn't afford my hourly rate, but you don't need to. This one's on the house." Harold Berenson, the coin dealer, arrived at Croft's office on the third day. He was a gentle, white-haired man who wore a jeweler's loop on a chain around his neck and handled each coin with the reverence of a priest handling communion wafers. His examination took less than an hour. He set the last coin down, removed his loop, and folded his hands. 6 St. Gaudens double eagles, Berenson said. All mint state, MS 64 to MS 65. The 1927 D is the standout. In this condition, at auction, you're looking at $8,000 to $12,000 for that single coin. The others range from $2,800 to $5,000 each. Conservative total estimate for the collection, $32,000 to $38,000. If you consign them to a major numismatic auction house, Heritage or Stack's Bowers, the competitive bidding environment could push the total significantly higher. Marcus sat in a plastic chair in a university laboratory, 18 years old, wearing borrowed clothes, and listened to a Smithsonian-certified expert tell him that his grandmother's gift to a dead soldier was worth more than Dale Roush had earned in the last 5 years combined. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a strange, aching gratitude directed at a man he had never met, a young soldier from New Orleans who had sealed his courage into a metal box and trusted the future to find it. The news broke on a Thursday. Dr. Croft, with Marcus's explicit consent and Denise Watkins's legal guidance, held a press conference at Vanderbilt University. The event was originally scheduled for a small lecture hall, but by the morning of the conference, the story had already leaked to the Associated Press through a graduate student who had seen the digitized microfilm. The lecture hall was standing room only. Camera crews from 4 Nashville television stations lined the back wall. A reporter from the Washington Post sat in the second row. Dr. Croft presented the findings with academic precision, walking the audience through the journal, the microfilm, the authentication process, and the historical significance of the documents. He projected the key microfilm images onto a screen behind him, the damning margin notes enlarged to a size that made them impossible to ignore. He concluded his presentation with a single sentence. These documents were preserved because a 20-year-old soldier named Joseph Delacroix believed the truth was worth more than his own safety. They were found because an 18-year-old named Marcus Delaney believed an $8 gamble was worth more than despair. The room erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Marcus sat in the front row, wearing a new button-down shirt Amara had bought him, and felt the weight of every eye in the room. He was not comfortable. He was not enjoying this. But when a reporter asked him why he hadn't simply sold the coins and the cash and walked away, Marcus leaned into the microphone and said something that would be quoted in every major newspaper in the country by Friday morning. Because somebody buried this man's truth in a box for 53 years, and I know what it feels like to be buried. I wasn't going to let that happen to him again. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. The Pentagon issued a statement acknowledging the existence of the intelligence assessments and announcing an internal review. The Senate Armed Services Committee opened a preliminary inquiry. The families of soldiers killed during the operations referenced in the documents began contacting Denise Watkins's office, seeking access to the records. The estate of William Hargrove, the lobbyist who had contacted Delacroix before his disappearance, issued a terse statement through their attorneys denying any involvement in Delacroix's case. No one believed them. A cold case unit in Louisiana reopened the investigation into Joseph Delacroix's disappearance. And in Gallatin, Tennessee, the story landed like a bomb in the specific, small-scale life of Dale Roush. Marcus had not spoken to Dale or Ray since the night he was thrown out. He had not called. He had not driven past the trailer. He had not wasted a single calorie of his dwindling energy on the men who had discarded him. But the story found them anyway, the way stories always find the people who most need to hear them. It arrived through the television screen at the Travelers Bar on Route 31, where Dale Roush sat on his usual stool on a Thursday evening, drinking his usual bourbon, when the 6 o'clock news opened with a segment about a Gallatin teenager who had discovered a historic military treasure in a storage unit he purchased for $8. The bartender turned up the volume. Dale watched Marcus's face fill the screen. He watched the Vanderbilt press conference footage. He watched the reporter describe the estimated value of the gold coins and the national significance of the documents. He watched his former stepson, the boy he had used as a source of government checks and then thrown out with a bag of wet clothes, sit in a university lecture hall surrounded by professors and federal attorneys and speak with a quiet, devastating dignity that Dale had never once seen in his own mirror. Dale called Marcus that night. Marcus was in the Nashville hotel room that Denise Watkins had arranged, reviewing documents with Amara and Dr. Croft. His phone buzzed with a number he recognized. He let it ring. It rang again and again. On the fourth call, Marcus picked up. He didn't say hello. He just waited. Marcus. Dale's voice was thick, the consonants softened by bourbon. Listen, I saw the news. That's real good what you found. Real good. I always knew you were a smart kid. Marcus said nothing. Look, I feel bad about how things went down. Ray, he's the one who, he pushed for it. I didn't want to kick you out like that. You know me, Marcus. I took care of you for years after your mama passed. Marcus closed his eyes. He could hear the television still playing in the background on Dale's end, the tinny echo of a studio audience laughing at something. He thought about the gold bracelet. His mother's bracelet, the one Dale had stolen from the wooden box. The last physical piece of Angela Delaney that Marcus had been meant to carry into his adult life. Where's my mother's bracelet, Dale? Silence on the line. A long, wet, damning silence. I don't know what the gold bracelet that was in her box. The one she wore every Sunday. The one that was there when I packed my things and gone when I checked at Ray's door. Where is it? More silence. Then, quietly, the voice of a man who understood that the lie was no longer large enough to hide behind. I pawned it. Last month. I needed the money for the electric bill. How much did you get for it? $40. Marcus let the number sit in the air. $40. His mother's bracelet, the one she had worn to church, the one she had clasped around her wrist on the morning of her wedding, the one she had asked the hospice nurse to make sure Marcus received, had been converted into $40 and fed into Dale Roush's electric meter. Marcus, listen, I can make it right. I'll get it back from the pawn shop. Just help me out a little. You got all that money now. We're family. We were never family, Dale. You were a man who cashed checks with my mother's name on them and called it parenting. You took everything she left me. You sold her bracelet for $40. And when the check stopped, you put me on the street. Marcus, please. Don't call me again. Marcus hung up. He set the phone on the nightstand, face down, and pressed his palms against his eyes. Amara, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, pretending to read, set down her book and crossed the room. She sat on the edge of the bed next to him and placed one hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence between them was the kind that holds weight without breaking. 2 days later, Denise Watkins called Marcus with news that arrived like a second earthquake. During the legal proceedings to formalize Marcus's ownership of the Footlocker contents, a routine title search on the storage unit had produced an unexpected result. Unit 7 at Riverside Self-Storage had been rented on November 3, 1971, under the name J. Delacroix. The rental agreement listed a cosigner. The cosigner's name was Angela M. Delacroix. Marcus read the name 3 times. Angela. His mother's name was Angela. Her maiden name, the name she had carried before she married Dale Roush, was not on any document Marcus had ever seen. Dale had destroyed most of Angela's personal paperwork after she died, claiming it was clutter. Marcus had never known his mother's maiden name. He had never been told, and he had never had reason to ask. Denise pulled the Sumner County vital records. Angela Marie Delacroix was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, on June 14, 1975. Her father was listed as Joseph Henri Delacroix, the same Joseph Delacroix who had sealed a Footlocker in a Tennessee storage unit 4 years before his daughter was born and then vanished from the face of the earth. The room went very quiet. Marcus sat in the chair by the window, looking out at the Nashville skyline without seeing it. His grandfather, the soldier in the photograph, the young man standing in front of the helicopter with the jungle behind him. The man who wrote "Tell Mama I Was Brave" was his grandfather. Joseph Delacroix had driven north from New Orleans in December of 1971, fleeing the people who wanted to silence him. He had rented a storage unit in a small Tennessee town, sealed his truth inside a Footlocker, and then disappeared. His daughter, Angela, had grown up in New Orleans without a father, eventually moving to Tennessee, where she married a man named Dale Roush and had a son named Marcus. She had never known what happened to her father. She had never known that the answers were sitting in a storage unit less than 5 miles from the trailer where she died. And Marcus, thrown out of that trailer with nothing, had walked into a storage auction and bought his own grandfather's legacy for $8. He picked up the photograph from the nightstand. The young soldier at Firebase Ripcord. Marcus looked at the face, at the serious eyes, the lean jaw, the set of the mouth. He was looking at his own face. The resemblance was so obvious, so undeniable, that he couldn't believe he hadn't seen it the first time he held the photograph. But he hadn't been looking for a family resemblance. He hadn't been looking for a family at all. He had been looking for a reason to survive. The coin sold at auction 6 weeks later through Heritage Auctions in Dallas. The competitive bidding environment Harold Berenson had predicted materialized with force. The 1927 D. St. Gaudens Double Eagle, graded MS. 65 by the Professional Coin Grading Service, sold for $14,200, nearly double Berenson's conservative estimate, driven by the extraordinary provenance story that had made national news. The full collection brought in $51,000. Combined with the cash from the Footlocker and a finder's fee negotiated by Denise Watkins from a historical preservation fund administered by Vanderbilt, Marcus Delaney, who had been sleeping behind a gas station dumpster 6 weeks earlier, had a verified, legally protected, tax-documented sum of $94,000 in a trust account bearing his name. He did not buy a car. He did not buy clothes. He did not rent a luxury apartment or take a vacation. The first thing Marcus Delaney did with his money was walk into the pawn shop on Route 31 in Gallatin, Tennessee, and buy back his mother's gold bracelet. The pawnbroker wanted $65. Marcus paid it without negotiating. He held the bracelet in his palm, feeling the familiar weight of it. The delicate chain links his mother's wrist had warmed 1,000 times, and he clasped it around his own wrist, where it would remain every day for the rest of his life. The second thing he did was enroll in the GED program at Volunteer State Community College. Amara Osei personally tutored him in the evenings, and Marcus passed the exam 8 weeks later with scores in the 97th percentile. The third thing he did was establish the Joseph Delacroix Memorial Fund, a scholarship administered through Vanderbilt University's Center for Military and Veteran Studies, providing financial support to first-generation college students from military families. The initial endowment was $20,000. Within a year, public donations had grown the fund to over $200,000. The journal and the microfilm were donated to the National Archives, where they were cataloged as part of the permanent Vietnam War records collection. Dr. Croft published a peer-reviewed paper on the documents that was cited in a subsequent congressional hearing on military transparency. The cold case investigation in Louisiana produced no conviction. The trail was too old, the principals too dead, but the case file was officially reclassified from missing person to suspected homicide. Joseph Delacroix's name was added to a memorial wall at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Education Center, not as a combat casualty, but as a veteran who gave his life in pursuit of truth. Dale Roush watched all of this from the barstool at the Travelers Bar. He watched Marcus appear on the local news, then the national news, then a segment on a Sunday morning network program where Marcus sat across from a journalist and spoke about his grandfather's courage with a composure and eloquence that made Dale feel, for the first time in his life, genuinely small. Dale did not call Marcus again. Ray Roush moved out of the trailer 3 months later, citing a dispute with the landlord. Dale moved back in alone. The trailer was exactly as empty as it had been when Angela was alive, but now the emptiness had a different quality. It was no longer the emptiness of a man who didn't care. It was the emptiness of a man who understood, too late, what he had thrown away. Marcus never confronted Dale publicly. He never gave an interview where he named his stepfather or described the abuse and neglect he had endured. He never sought revenge. But the story told itself. The people of Gallatin, the same people who had watched Marcus grow up quiet and invisible, who had driven past him sleeping behind the Minute Mart without stopping, who had known Dale Roush was cashing a dead woman's benefit checks and said nothing. Those people now saw Marcus Delaney on their television screens being praised by senators and professors. And they saw Dale Roush on his bar stool, and they understood exactly what kind of man discards an 18-year-old boy into the rain and then calls him family when the cameras turn on. The karma was not dramatic. There was no arrest, no public humiliation, no courtroom scene. It was quieter than that, and it was worse. It was the slow, corrosive recognition, settling into Dale Roush's bones the way Tennessee rain settles into old wood, that he had been given custody of something precious and had treated it like trash. And the whole world could see it. On a Sunday morning in April, 6 months after he had walked into Riverside self-storage with $8 and a plastic bag, Marcus Delaney stood in the doorway of a small, clean, one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Nashville. The apartment was modest. It had a kitchen table, a second-hand bookshelf already filling with volumes Amara kept bringing him, and a window that faced east, catching the morning light. On the nightstand beside his bed sat his mother's wooden box, the gold bracelet coiled inside it next to the photograph of Joseph Delacroix at Firebase Ripcord. Marcus had just returned from the storage facility, where he had visited Unit 7 one final time. The unit was empty now, cleared out, the Footlocker transferred to Vanderbilt's archive. The bare concrete floor still bore the faint grooves of the combination scratched into the corner. 17-42-08. Someone had carved those numbers into the floor 53 years ago, knowing that the right person would eventually kneel down and look. Marcus stood in the empty unit for a long time, letting the silence fill the space where a young soldier's truth had waited in the dark for half a century. He thought about his grandfather, a 20-year-old kid from New Orleans who had gone to war, lost his leg, found the truth, and been destroyed for refusing to let it go. A man who had driven north in the middle of the night, alone, terrified, clutching a metal box full of evidence that nobody in power wanted to exist. A man who had scratched a combination into a concrete floor because he believed, with a faith that transcended his own survival, that someone would come along and open what he had sealed. He thought about his mother, a woman who had grown up without a father, who had married badly, who had raised a son alone in a trailer on Plunkett Creek Road, and who had died without ever knowing that her father had been a hero. Marcus wished he could tell her. He wished he could sit beside her bed in the hospice room that smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers and say, "Mama, your daddy didn't abandon you. He was brave. He was so brave. And he left something for us, sealed in the dark, waiting for the right moment to be found." He thought about himself, an 18-year-old boy who had been thrown away by every institution and every person who was supposed to protect him. A boy who had slept behind a dumpster, who had eaten gas station peanut butter for dinner, who had been fired for the crime of having nowhere to live. A boy who had walked into a storage auction with $8 and walked out carrying a dead man's courage in a plastic grocery bag. Marcus pulled the rolling door of Unit 7 down for the last time. The metal shrieked against the tracks, the same sound it had made on the day of the auction, but this time it sounded different. It didn't sound like a door closing. It sounded like a door that had been opened and would never need to be sealed again. He walked out of Riverside self-storage into the April morning. The sun was warm on his face. The dogwoods along Highway 31E were blooming, their white blossoms trembling in a breeze that carried the faint, green smell of Tennessee spring. Marcus put his hands in his pockets, felt the familiar weight of his mother's bracelet on his wrist, and walked toward the road. He was 18 years old. He had $94,000 in a trust account, a GED, a scholarship fund bearing his grandfather's name, and a one-bedroom apartment with a window that faced the sunrise. He had a former teacher who had become something closer to family than anyone who shared his blood had ever managed. He had a photograph of a young soldier who looked exactly like him, standing in front of a helicopter, asking someone to tell his mama he was brave. And he had a truth that no one would ever seal away again. Sometimes, rock bottom is not the end of the story. Sometimes, it is the floor beneath the floor, the place where someone buried something extraordinary and trusted the future to find it. Marcus Delaney was thrown away by the people who were supposed to love him. He was discarded, dismissed, and forgotten. And then he spent his last $8 on a locked box in the dark, and he found everything that mattered. The most important doors haven't been opened yet. The most important truths are still waiting in sealed rooms, in forgotten footlockers, in the quiet places where brave people hid what the powerful tried to destroy. All it takes is someone desperate enough, or courageous enough, to turn the handle. The week before the press conference, something happened that Marcus did not expect and could not have prepared for. Amara had driven him back to Gallatin to retrieve the footlocker from the storage unit and transport it to Vanderbilt under Dr. Croft's chain of custody protocol. They arrived at Riverside Self-Storage just after noon, the autumn sun thin and pale behind a shelf of gray clouds. Marcus unlocked the rolling door of Unit 7, and the familiar smell of old leather and machine oil drifted out into the cold air. The footlocker sat exactly where he had left it, undisturbed, its olive-drab surface catching the flat light. He knelt beside it, dialed the combination, and opened the lid to verify the contents before Croft's team packed it for transport. The flag was there. The uniform was there. Everything was accounted for. But as Marcus lifted the dress uniform jacket to hand it to Dr. Reeves's assistant, something shifted inside the lining that he hadn't noticed before. Not the microfilm canister. That was sewn into the left panel. This was in the right panel, near the bottom hem. A small, stiff shape that crinkled faintly under his fingers. "There's something else in here," Marcus said, pressing the fabric between his thumb and forefinger. Dr. Reeves stepped forward immediately, pulling on her archival gloves. She took the jacket from Marcus and laid it flat on a portable examination table her team had set up inside the unit. With a surgical seam ripper, she carefully opened 6 inches of the interior stitching along the right hem. She reached inside with long, thin forceps and withdrew a small, sealed envelope. It was no larger than an index card, made of heavy cream-colored stock, and sealed with a circle of red wax that had cracked but held. On the front, in Joseph Delacroix's precise blue handwriting, were 2 words. For Angela. The air inside the storage unit changed. Everyone felt it. Dr. Reeves set the envelope on the examination table and stepped back. Amara put her hand over her mouth. Marcus stared at the envelope and felt a pressure building behind his eyes that he could not name and could not stop. For Angela. His mother's name, written by a father she never met, hidden inside a uniform jacket that had been sealed in darkness since before she was born. Joseph Delacroix had known. He had known he might not survive. He had known that if the people hunting him succeeded, his unborn daughter would grow up without answers, without a father, without understanding why he had vanished from her life before it even began. And so he had written her a letter and sewn it into the only thing he trusted to endure. Marcus picked up the envelope. His hands were steady. He broke the wax seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same as the journal, but different in tone. The journal had been written by a soldier documenting evidence. This letter had been written by a father speaking to a child he might never hold. "My dearest Angela, you are not born yet, but your mama tells me you are coming in the spring, and I have already decided you will have her eyes and my stubbornness. I am writing this because there are men who want to silence me, and I am not sure I will be there to walk you to school, or teach you to ride a bicycle, or tell you the stories my grandmother told me about the bayou. If you are reading this, it means I was not there. And I need you to know that it was not because I chose to leave. I chose to stay. I chose to tell the truth, even when the truth made powerful men afraid. I want you to know that your father was not a coward. I want you to know that I loved you before I ever saw your face. And I want you to know that whatever I leave behind in this box, it is yours. Not the money or the coins. Those are just metal and paper. What is yours is the knowledge that your father stood up when it would have been easier to sit down. That is your inheritance. That is the only thing I have that is worth passing on. Be brave, Angela. Be braver than me. And if you ever have children of your own, tell them their grandfather tried. Tell them he tried. All my love, always and no matter what. Your daddy, Joseph." Marcus read the letter once, silently, his lips barely moving. Then he folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and pressed it against his chest. He did not cry. He had spent his childhood learning how to hold everything inside, how to swallow grief the way you swallow medicine, quickly and without tasting it. But something cracked open behind his sternum that morning in Unit 7, something that had been sealed as long as the footlocker itself. It was not sadness. It was recognition. He recognized his grandfather's voice because it sounded like the voice he had been searching for his entire life. The voice of someone who would not leave by choice. The voice of someone who wanted to be there. The voice that says, "I loved you before I saw your face," and means it with a ferocity that transcends death and distance and 53 years of silence. Amara drove them back to Nashville. Marcus sat in the passenger seat with the envelope in his jacket pocket, next to his mother's wooden box. He didn't speak for the entire drive. Amara didn't press him. She understood that some silences are not empty. Some silences are so full they cannot hold a single additional word without breaking. When they reached the hotel, Marcus went to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened his mother's wooden box. He placed the envelope inside, next to the photograph and the social security card, and closed the lid. His mother had never read her father's letter. She had lived and died without knowing it existed. But Marcus had read it, and he understood now that Joseph Delacroix had not been writing only to Angela. He had been writing to whoever came next. He had been writing to Marcus. "Be brave. Be braver than me." Marcus closed his eyes, pressed his palm flat against the lid of the box, and whispered into the empty room, "I will, Grandpa. I will. Thank you so much for staying until the very end." Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.